When Sega rolled into E3 2000, it needed to pull out all the stops. This show was going to be the North American unveiling of its nemesis, the PlayStation 2, and the last shot at putting the Dreamcast on the map and keeping Sega in the game as a console maker. It made sure it had all the big Dreamcast games it could muster for the coming holiday season, including its own crown jewel titles like Shenmue, Jet Grind Radio, Skies of Arcadia, and Echo the Dolphin, a full complement of its Sega sports games, spot-on perfect ports of arcade games like 18-Wheeler American Pro Trucker, Power Stone 2, and Silent Scope, the first lineup of online games any console had ever seen, including Quake 3, 4x4 Evolution, and Phantasy Star Online, with even a decent complement of third-party games like Tony Hawk Pro Skater 2, Test Drive Le Mans, Grandia 2, and Tom Clancy Rainbow Six Rogue Spirit. But there was one thing Sega of America had as its ace in the hole for that show. The biggest name and most important game Sega ever had in its arsenal. Sonic the Hedgehog. The character that had made Sega a household name, especially in America. It had been Sega's lead game when launching the Dreamcast to phenomenal success on 9/9/99, right alongside Sonic Adventure. So Sega came to E3 2000 not just with one new Sonic game, but two. One was the spin-off party game title, the often forgotten Sonic Shuffle. More importantly though, Sega of America announced right on the first day of the show that Sonic Adventure 2 was already deep in development and will be coming to the Dreamcast the next year in time for Sonic's 10th anniversary. Its press release was all that was made publicly available, but behind closed doors, they also showed a 2-minute trailer to select members of the gaming press, who then did what they were expected to do and leaked what they saw to their respective websites, and thus began the rumor-infused hype train for Sonic Adventure 2. The game's announcement did come as a surprise. Not so much that there would be a sequel to Sonic Adventure, but that it was already far along enough for Sega to show something to the public or the press. Sonic Adventure had only just hit store shelves 8 months ago. How did this come to be? The process was an echo of the past. After the development of the first Sonic the Hedgehog game gave Sega's internal Studio Number 8 its name as Sonic Team, that team then split up in different directions. Some went to work on conquering the next technical challenge by making their next game for Sega's new CD-based platform, the Sega CD. This game would be Sonic CD. The other group moved to the United States and set up shop at Sega of America's newly opened Sega Technical Institute to develop the direct sequel, Sonic the Hedgehog 2, over in the United States. After the completion of Sonic Adventure brought the mascot character back from irrelevance and moved him into the world of 3D gameplay, the team once again fractured in different directions. The main bulk of the team in Japan was once again tasked with conquering Sega's next major technical hurdle, as they were set to work on the first massively multiplayer online RPG for a home console, and the inheritor of Sega's second most famous franchise, Phantasy Star Online. Another faction would once again move to America. Since the Sega Technical Institute was defunct, they would set up shop as Sonic Team USA. Both teams would take on smaller initial tasks to test the waters for their next moves. The Japanese home team would develop the puzzle game Choo Choo Rocket in order to get valuable experience in producing online multiplayer games before moving on to the much bigger task of an MMO. While Sonic Team USA would first be tasked with polishing the original, buggier Japanese Sonic Adventure game before its Western releases. The home team would also begin supervising one of Sega's quiet background moves to dip its toes into the waters of cross-platform publishing, as Sonic Team Japan oversaw the development at SNK of Sonic Pocket Adventure for the Neo Geo Pocket Color, which would release in late 1999 to very good impressions from consumers and critics. While the Japanese home office had its hands full with all of this, on top of its dabbling in its first arcade game, Samba de Amigo, the task of iterating on Sonic's first real 3D game fell to Sonic Team USA, who began work right at the end of 1999 after finishing the Western localizations of Sonic Adventure. This task would be in good hands though. since Sonic Team USA was headed up by the director of the first Sonic Adventure game, Takashi Iizuka, who was also a veteran of the development of Sonic 3 and Knuckles back in the series' heyday, and a former employee at Sega Technical Institute the last time Sonic Team worked across continents. Naturally, since Sonic Adventure 2 was a sequel, it didn't have to start from scratch, and could instead start from the foundation built by its predecessor. This was fortunately recognized by Sonic Team USA, who early on decided they wanted to take the things they believed worked best in the original game and pare back the other elements that got in the way of achieving those things. While Sonic Adventure had generally been well received upon release, certain parts of the game were criticized as being repetitive repackagings of certain stages, such as some of Tails and Amy's levels, or entirely out of place, such as Big the Cat's entire storyline and gameplay. Looking at the original game, the team believed the best gameplay sections that work were the speedy level completion areas from Sonic, the treasure-finding segments for Knuckles, and the target shooting gameplay from E102 Gamma. Relatively unbeknownst to those watching the E3 trailer with eager anticipation, this exact path of simplifying the gameplay modes was being broadcast in the trailer, as it really only showcased Sonic, Knuckles, and Dr. Eggman, each of which would be the lead characters for each play mode. The thing that took the lion's share of attention and speculation was the thematic contrasts being flashed on screen, concluding with the image of a dark version of Sonic. While Sonic CD had introduced a mechanized version of Sonic, this character appeared to be a real, actual hedgehog, and its meaning was entirely unknown to players at the time, who would speculate on this dark Sonic for some time to come. For much of the rest of the year 2000, all Sonic fans would be teased with would be more cryptic, contextless screenshots, like had been initially released at E3 alongside the trailer. Finally, the gaming public was given its first real taste of the game when a demo was unexpectedly included alongside Phantasy Star Online when it shipped in Japan in November of 2000 and the US in January of 2001. This demo showed off the first iconic stage of the game as Sonic runs downhill through a cityscape heavily inspired by Sonic Team USA's home in San Francisco. It gave two initial impressions. One, Sonic's speedy gameplay was not only intact in the second iteration, but possibly even more refined and better than the first game. Two, the graphics engine had been given a major facelift, which was impressive since the original game was a showcase title for the Dreamcast and what the next generation of console games could do in general. But since it came out back in 1998, it was already a little aged. So much more nicely detailed and textured environments, much more heavily modeled characters, and the 60 FPS frame rate was a major leap over the first game, a true second-generation iteration on the first. But this demo still didn't answer any of the major questions. What was that dark hedgehog? Where was Tails or Amy? What exactly is the plot of this game? That would all wait to be answered until the months prior to release, as Sega began spinning up its marketing machine for the game around April for a June release, right on the 10th anniversary of the original Sonic the Hedgehog. However, the Sega of April 2001 was dramatically different than the one from January. On the very last days of January 2001, word finally became official that Sega was discontinuing the Dreamcast and exiting the hardware business in favor of bringing its games to other platforms. So Sonic Adventure 2 suddenly transformed from a Hail Mary shot at selling the Dreamcast, like its forebearers had done for the Genesis, into a swan song for Sega's time as a console maker. It went from being the latest Sonic game for a Sega machine to the last Sonic game for a Sega machine. Making its release on the 10th anniversary, the requisite special anniversary editions of the game, and special Sonic Dreamcast bundles, a decidedly more somber event than the celebration it was initially expected to be. It was instead being overshadowed by regular announcements from Sega over new games that they were developing for all the other consoles. Since Sega had spun off all of its development studios into independent companies a year prior, each of them sorted into different camps when it came to which console they will be focusing on. While many of them gravitated toward the Xbox, and most steered clear of the PS2, Sonic Team and Amusement Vision were pretty singular in their love of Nintendo and their desire to work on the GameCube. This was choreographed well in advance, as Yuji Naka was reportedly spotted at Nintendo's initial unveiling of the system at Space World 2000, when Sega was ostensibly still a competitor. Even more interestingly, in an interview that summer, Shigeru Miyamoto was asked if there was any competitor's game that he liked, and he gave a surprising answer. As opposed to his usual answer that he doesn't really look at his competitors, he enthusiastically answered that he liked Sonic Team's Samba de Amigo very much, and thought it was an excellent game for kids and families. Whether this was just Miyamoto going off his usual script, or a sign of some background courtship going on is anybody's guess, but it's certainly interesting to note. While Sega officially made its first announcement of games for the GameCube at E3 2001, it only showed Super Monkey Ball, Phantasy Star Online, and Virtua Striker 2002. Sonic Adventure 2 was still only being shown for the Dreamcast, even though everyone, even Sega of America's own Peter Moore, expressed their expectation that it would be coming to the GameCube at some point, since putting Sonic on the Nintendo system seemed to make natural sense. Still, Sega and Sonic Team remained officially mum on Sonic's fate until after the Dreamcast game had come out, which was either a sensible attempt not to cut the floor out from under a Dreamcast game before it had even gone on sale, or simply a technical fact that they hadn't really started any work on the GameCube yet. When Nintendo's Space World 2001 event rolled around in late August, just a few weeks from the GameCube's launch, Sonic Team would finally play its hand and showed up on the show floor complete with Sonic and Shadow characters on hand to shake hands with Mario, creating a Fall of the Berlin Wall moment for all the veterans of the Sega-Nintendo wars of the early 90s. The demo version of their port that they were showing on the show floor was said to only be 10% complete and only featured 2 playable levels, but the game appeared to be absolutely spot on to the Dreamcast original, although Sega and Sonic Team said they would be adding enhancements to the GameCube version. One of those enhancements was announced a few weeks later in September, as Sonic Team revealed what they would be doing to replace the functionality of the VMU from the Dreamcast that allowed players to raise their chows on their memory card like a Tamagotchi via the screen and control pad. On the GameCube version, Sega will be taking advantage of Nintendo's own attempt at handheld-to-console compatibility by supporting its Game Boy Advance to GameCube link cable. In fact, Sonic Adventure 2 would end up being the first GameCube game to support the Game Boy Advance link cable. The GameCube game wouldn't just link to the Game Boy Advance on its own, but would actually interconnect with their new Game Boy Advance game, Sonic Advance, which was fittingly enough being worked on by the same team that had cut their teeth on that well-received Neo Geo Pocket Color game, under Sonic Team Japan's tutelage. Since SNK's handheld had met the same fate as Sega's console, that development team was now also an independent third-party company called DIMPS, with Sonic Advance being one of their very first games. Both games would be headlining Sega's showcase when they attended the Fall Tokyo Game Show in October. This is where Sonic Team would show off some of the additions that they were adding to the GameCube version, and give the game its final title as a result. They would announce a far more robust multiplayer mode from the Dreamcast original, and thus would differentiate it with the full name Sonic Adventure 2 Battle. The game would also appear to be fully graphically refined on the GameCube, with a few tweaks to improve over the original thanks to the additional hardware. With just 6 months in development to take the game from the Dreamcast to the GameCube, the game would hit Japanese store shelves on December 20th, 2001, and would arrive on US shores on February 11th, 2002, arriving alongside Nintendo's Game Boy Advance link cable and Sonic Advance on the Game Boy Advance, making for a whirlwind of releases ringing in Sonic's debut on Nintendo consoles. Starting up the game on the GameCube, you'll get the first sign that Sonic Team was both interested in pushing all the hardware buttons it could, and making sure that this version included everything the Dreamcast one did, since you're greeted with a prompt for progressive scan. Something most Dreamcast games supported via the VGA adapter that was available for the system to hook it up to a computer monitor or certain compatible HD TVs. This version also opens with a new intro sequence rendered in-engine, which looks very nice and really fits the game's theme. Naturally, a few things are replaced to reflect the system change, such as the rendering of a GameCube and GameCube memory cards and controllers in place of Dreamcast ones. The game has a few options, such as the standard memory card save load screen, stereo mono auto choices, and rumble functions, but also less common ones, such as changing the game's language, as many players prefer the Japanese voice acting over the English voices. It also has a choice of modifying the menus themselves with different themes based on each character in the game, with their voices doing the narration of the menu system. There's also an old-fashioned sound test, a staple of the Sonic series going back to the original games on the Genesis, letting you sample the game's soundtrack. Plus, carried over from the first Sonic adventure is your emblem collection count. What seems a little weird to include is a straight-up written tutorial section where Omo-Chow, the robotic Chow character, tells you how to play the game with written instructions and controller images. A strange thing to include for a series that's never really been all that complex in its game mechanics. Getting into the game itself, when you select the single-player mode, you're given the choice between the heroes and the villains, labeled as light and dark. It's largely taken for granted decades later, but it was still pretty uncommon in gaming at the time to straight up be given the choice of playing as the bad guys, doing bad things. There were certainly role-playing games, although many of them were PC games, where you could choose to walk the path of an anti-hero or an outright villain depending on what you do in the game, but to just straight up set out the good side looking to save the world, and the bad side looking to conquer or destroy it, that was still a choice that back in 2001 gamers were rarely given. As we mentioned during the development history, Sonic Team USA decided to focus and build on what it considered the best gameplay modes from the first Sonic adventure, with a hero and villain character for each to mirror each other. So we have the speedy run to the end of the level scenes from Sonic and Shadow, the kind of levels that make Sonic games Sonic games. These are the go fast, speed around corners, make quick jumps, slam into enemies, hit boost pads and item boxes, and see how fast you can push the game engine to render the beautiful world around you. The fact this was translated pretty well into 3D is a testament to Sonic Team's true ownership of their franchise, but also a reflection of the limitations of what Sonic games really are, and what 3 dimensions force upon them. Sonic and Shadow levels are very linear. The journey from the beginning to the end of the level is more akin to a roller coaster than an adventure. You don't really need to do any exploring, although there are flourishes put in there to encourage that on your second and third runs of each level, such as hidden shrine monuments and the Chow Garden keys, which are barely hidden. This isn't a criticism, just an observation of how the game works. A fast-paced, thrilling, quick, twitching action platformer can be a fun-as-hell experience to play, and Sonic Adventure 2 does it better than most have at these speeds. True to its origins, it really is the anti-Mario, since 3D Mario games and its imitators are usually slower, more methodical, plodding adventures, moving around a small sandbox environment, while Sonic is a fast-paced, short attention span burst of pick-up-and-play level busting and graphical splendor. Both are perfectly valid and enjoyable methods of presenting and playing a game. I myself happen to enjoy both quite a lot. In part to speed up and accelerate the pace of getting to gameplay, this game did do away with the overworld adventure segments from the first, and just ferry the players from level to level, with cutscenes putting the storyline in place. The other level type that's also fairly linear, and rightly so, are the shooting segments headed by Tails and Eggman in their respective robot walking devices. For Eggman, this accessory always made sense because he's very rarely ever appeared outside of one of his devices. For Tails, it was a bit weirder, and was very off-putting initially to many fans of the series, since he was usually a free-roaming character just like Sonic, with the added ability of flying. Instead, since he was the closest analog character to Eggman with his own technical and tinkering abilities, he became the equivalent mech shooting character for the good guys. Both of them inherit their gameplay directly from E102 Gamma in the first game, which in and of itself inherits a lot of its mechanics from classic Sega on-rail shooters such as Panzer Dragoon and Space Harrier. However, unlike those games, these characters do traverse a fully 3D world. That is, the player has control over the movement of the characters within these worlds, but the worlds themselves are still pretty linear affairs, much like Sonic and Shadow. There's an endpoint you need to get to, and you slowly trod your way along in giant robot legs while blasting everything in the way on your way there. The main gameplay loop here is really trying to rack up big combos by locking onto multiple enemies and objects at once, and then releasing a barrage of fire. This is the element borrowed directly from the Panzer Dragoon series that made taking aim at multiple enemies in a 3D environment both easier and much more enjoyable. Lastly, there is the treasure hunting mode, taken directly from Knuckles' section in the last game. This time, there was no analogous character on the dark side, so a new one was invented with Rouge the Bat. These are the level types that are more three-dimensional in nature, more akin to a Mario-style platformer. You're dropped into a 3D sandbox world and made to explore it in search of items you need to collect. This becomes a combined Easter egg hunt with elements of hot and cold, as you are given a detector on screen to sensing your proximity to these crystal shards. This aspect of once again collecting the Broken Master Emerald plays out much like it did in the first game, as a side story to the main quest going on in between the other characters seeking out the Chaos Emeralds. But of course, the good guys and bad guys do all end up working together later in the story. Now, despite the controversy within the Sonic fandom over whether these other modes are good or bad, and if the games should be all Sonic levels instead of featuring any of these alternative modes, the other modes and levels themselves are well-made, well-crafted experiences. The graphics are brilliant, keeping up high frame rates with very high texture quality and really well-animated cartoonish characters that are practically iconic at this point. The controls and mechanics to each character works, and works well. Maybe it's the fact that this was another early GameCube game I owned in real life back in the day, but it certainly feels pretty natural to pick up the controller and run downhill and all around as Sonic, to blast through tunnels with Eggman, or to fly around as Knuckles. Previously introduced elements like Sonic's Spin Dash make a return, alongside new mechanics like rail sliding, which was just something that appeared in the demo, and then was integrated with some kind of synergistic sponsorship deal with a brand of real-world sneakers called Soap Shoes that supposedly allowed for doing this in real life. Try that at your own risk, please. Aside from enshrining these alternative game modes, the other controversial aspect of this game was bringing in new characters and expanding the scope of storytelling in the Sonic universe. Of course, all of this had been begun in Sonic Adventure 1, but Shadow the Hedgehog and Rouge the Bat in particular were, let's say, unique additions to the character roster. Shadow for his often one-note, brooding demeanor that would devolve into parody over time, and Rouge for her bizarre, verging on uncomfortable anthropomorphic sexualization. These were things that would be more and more criticized and reconsidered as time went on and future installations in the series came along. For now, in 2001 and 2002, they still pretty unquestionably fit into the Sonic universe. At least the newer 3D-era rebooted Sonic universe that started with the first adventure game. Where Sonic Team sought to finish things they initially were unable to do thanks to time or hardware limitations on the Dreamcast, they now sought to beef up on the GameCube. As mentioned earlier, the battle added to the title was due to the far more robust multiplayer mode added in this new version. While the original Dreamcast mode had just a handful of levels playable across both the hero and dark characters, the GameCube version opened it up to all the game's levels and let each player pick from the entire character roster, rather than making one player have to be the dark side and the other automatically the light side character. The other thing Sonic Team wanted to make sure they worked into this improved port was the Game Boy Advance Link capability. Here they were technically just replicating the Dreamcast VMU mode that let players take their chows on the go, but this was far more robust, since the Game Boy Advance is a far more powerful piece of hardware than the VMU. If you hook up a GBA and transfer over your Chow into an empty Game Boy system, you get a little mini portable Chow Garden to go on the Game Boy Advance. However, since this program is just being loaded into the Game Boy Advance's memory, once you power your Game Boy off, the program and all the data are gone. The intended use case was for you to have a copy of the new portable Sonic game, Sonic Advance, and connect the two games simultaneously. With that game present in your Game Boy, you can actually more permanently save your Chow Garden data and come back to it at later times. Plus, on top of that nice feature, the Sonic Advance game was also being very well received as an excellent return to form for 2D Sonic gaming. Its art style kind of made it an alternate history of if Sonic games were made for the Super Nintendo. But really, gameplay-wise, it took directly after the Sonic Pocket Adventure game that the developer had made for the Neo Geo Pocket Color. But that game was so obscure, not many people knew it existed, let alone played it. One thing I particularly wanted to shout out is that Sonic Adventure 2 Battle is a wonderful time capsule of a moment when Sonic Team was one of Sega's most prominent teams above and beyond their namesake franchise, as this game is littered with references to all of Sonic Team's other games that they were also somewhat famous for. There's billboards for Phantasy Star Online, street names taking after Samba de Amigo, and the top of a building featuring the rotating head of Knights from Nights into Dreams. It's a reminder of an often forgotten era when Sonic Team was a more prolific studio, pumping out a lot of original games and ideas rather than just being the Sonic Team. There was one thing the Dreamcast version would still have that the GameCube version never would. That would be online connectivity. Right from the main menu, you can see the homepage option, which did let you dial into the Sonic Adventure 2 website, where you could get news from Sonic Team, a bulletin board system, downloadable content such as new outfits and kart racing stages, which are unlocked later on in the game. You also get some unique Chow Garden features, such as the downloadable Chow Black Market and the Chow Daycare system that lets you upload and trade Chow characters. Most of these downloadable features and Chow Garden editions would just be baked into the GameCube version and unlockable through completing certain objectives in the game. Still, an online mode was something entirely absent from the totally standalone GameCube console. Of course, I've almost passed over the Chows themselves. These little creatures draw their origins all the way back to Sonic Team's darling Saturn game, Nights into Dreams, but really became fully fleshed out characters in a game mode in the first Sonic Adventure game, where they heavily capitalized on the Tamagotchi era of virtual pets to give players something to invest time and effort into in between levels, and making several of the game's emblems based on completing certain tasks with your Chows. In this game, you also have the Chow Garden, although rather than being a place you visit from the overworld, since there is no overworld and you just move from level to level, you instead have the option to find and grab the Chow Garden key during levels, and then your character is automatically taken there when the level is complete, to share the pickup collectibles they obtained during their gameplay, and fuse these characteristics and power-ups with the Chows, so as to later race and battle them against each other. Where Sonic Adventure 2 evolved over the first game was that since you now play as both light and dark characters, you can now evolve your initially neutral Chows into either good or evil Chows. Granted, during my gameplay, I did not have either the time or patience to raise them into the angel Chows of the light side, or the conscience to take the shortcut to making them evil by throwing them repeatedly against the wall. But that is indeed a new element of this game that opens the way to both good, heavenly Chow Garden that you can ascend to, or an evil, hellish one that you can descend to from the main stage. I'm not a big virtual pet guy, but I know this mode definitely has its fans. When Sonic Adventure 2 Battle released for the GameCube, owners of that system were itching and waiting for Nintendo's own main franchise to show up and justify their purchase. With Mario, Zelda, and Metroid a ways off, it was the surprise cavalry riding to the rescue that Sega was now around to bring one of its own crown franchises to fill that gap. And fill that gap it would. Sonic Adventure 2 Battle would go on to be the best-selling GameCube game in North America every month from its release in February until Super Mario Sunshine would eventually show up in August. The Dreamcast original had sold about 500,000 copies worldwide, while the GameCube version sold roughly that many just in North America in 2002. By the end of the GameCube's time on the market, Sonic Adventure 2 would rack up a little over 1.7 million units worldwide, and would be the best-selling third-party title on the GameCube. A pretty good record for the Blue Blur's first outing on his long-time Nemesis' hardware.